Terrific. I'll get started. My name is Mike Schneider. I'm an independent iPhone developer from Seattle. I've been giving this talk. It's been a while since I've given it, but I started giving this talk with the first 360 iDev back in 2009. It was in at the eBay headquarters in the Bay Area, and at the time I was a new iPhone developer. I had just started making apps, kind of a hobbyist. I had put some apps out that had done all right, but my coding skills were pretty weak. And so when I came to the conference, it was announced and they were looking for people to speak, and I was trying to think about what I could bring to contribute to this conference, since I really didn't know a whole lot about coding. My background is that I'm a lawyer, and so I thought, well, maybe I could give a talk about legal issues for iPhone developers and indie developers, about things they might not know. And so that's kind of the origin of this talk. My background is I was a corporate lawyer for many years doing technology law. I worked for a firm called Wilson Sonsini in the Bay Area, kind of like a big technology firm that did some work for Apple. They actually incorporated Apple. They incorporated Google. They're kind of like a VC startup law firm. And so I worked for them for a bunch of years, so I know a lot about software companies and their legal issues. I started tinkering with the iPhone SDK when it came out and put those apps out, and I was lucky enough that they did well enough that I was able to just kind of leave the firm and decide to go pursue my own thing. And so now I spend my time making iPhone apps and publishing them on the store. At this point, it's more about maintaining the old apps as opposed to launching new ones. And I still practice a little bit of law. And my main client is a company called Bungie, and they originally made a game called Halo. Were bought by Microsoft, got spun back out, and now we make a game called Destiny. And so I help them with all their kind of legal stuff, particularly around licensing. And so anytime if you see any Destiny merchandise on store shelves, there's a good chance I was involved with putting together the contracts to make that happen. And so that's my background. Let's see. I also, a while back, co-authored this book called The Business of iPhone App Development. You can tell it's kind of old because it says iPhone app development instead of just iOS. But there's a chapter in that book about legal issues that I wrote that's a good summary of the kinds of stuff that I talk about during this talk. So maybe look for that if you want to know more. And so I like to take this talk. First of all, I'm really glad that this talk is in the smaller room and not the bigger room, because I really prefer it to be interactive. I think I mentioned in the description of the session that you should bring questions. This stuff is a lot better if I can address things that you guys are actually thinking about, rather than kind of going through the laundry list of things that I think startups should care about and indie developers should care about. So I'll go through the slides. They're all really important, but there's plenty of time in this talk dedicated to answering questions and kind of taking side paths. So if you have any questions or something that you're facing, I can't get into too much specifics. So if there are real specific fact patterns, then it becomes like legal advice. But generally speaking, happy to talk to any issue that you guys are facing. And so keep that in mind. Feel free to shoot hands up if you want to. Don't feel bad about interrupting. There's no worries there. There's plenty of time for that. So I usually start with kind of the early stage of your company. You're starting your company out. And maybe you've just decided to leave your job, and you're starting your indie development shop, and you want to think about maybe forming an entity. And the reason you'll want to form an entity, as opposed to just kind of offering apps on the store under your own name, is that an entity provides you with limited liability, which means that if a user is hurt by your app, or if you end up in a contract with somebody that you end up breaching, that they can come at your company, but they don't come at you individually. Which means that if your app blows up and somebody dies because of it, hopefully that never happens. But if it did happen, you really don't want them suing you and taking your house and trying to sue you in your individual capacity. So this is really important stuff. That's the first reason to think about this stuff. And then the great thing is forming some kind of an entity is really not an expensive process. You can go online and do it. You don't need a fancy lawyer to create an entity. Usually, I would say you could probably set. I don't do this, so I don't know the exact prices, and it's different in every state. But in Washington, I think it's around $375 to form a LLC or a corporation, and you pay a few $100 kind of on an ongoing basis to kind of keep it up and running, and that gives you this protection. There's some other steps you need to kind of go through the motions and make sure you've got minutes and your company has some assets and maybe insurance. If your company is really just you and there's no assets there, occasionally you have to worry that somebody might do what's called piercing the corporate veil. But as a threshold move, forming a company is a no-brainer, and so you should definitely check it out. There's some questions. A lot of people ask, hey, should I form a corporation or should I form an LLC? They're both perfectly good for the limited liability purposes. Typically, I recommend an LLC for people that are a one-man shop or that are running a business where they plan to just put an app out and make money, and they're not going to raise money from investors. They're never going to kind of grow that business beyond themselves. So LLC is great for that because it's a simpler structure. You can create an LLC with any kind of rules that you like. So if you and a partner want to start a company and you want that limited liability, but you don't necessarily want the rigid corporate structure, you can create an LLC, and you can make the rules of your LLC be anything you want. You can say, okay, well, some of the members of the LLC have a right to percentage of the profits. Some of the members of the LLC, have a right to vote. Or I get paid this amount before anybody else gets paid, and you can create any kind of structure you want with an LLC, and that's a bonus. That's a benefit if you're trying to do something unique. It's a detriment if you're trying to build a company that you want to go raise money with, right? Because let's say you go to investors and you say, I've got this great company. We want you to invest in our company, and they'll say, okay, well, what are we getting? And you say, I'm an LLC. Then that's not like a deal breaker, but they may ask you to reincorporate because when they invest in an LLC, because an LLC can be like anything, they have to look at your membership agreement and see kind of what you made. Like, what is this thing I'm buying into? What is this animal you created? So the good news is you can do anything you want. Bad news is if you ever want to start selling shares, people are going to say, well, what is this thing? And if you pick a corporation as a format, like a S corporation, investors just know what that is. A share of a corporation comes with certain rights. If you are a shareholder, you have certain like minority shareholder interests that exist with a corporation that you can rely on. Corporations are also really great because for a big company with lots of people in it, if there ever is a dispute about the corporate structure or who should get paid what, there's lots of great case law out there about corporations. But LLCs are relatively new by comparison. So going to court to try to argue over your LLC membership agreement is going to give you a much less predictable result than if you had like a more standard corporation. But like I said, if it's just you, LLCs are super easy. And if you're thinking about going bigger at some point, the S corp is great too because you can start out small with an S corp, and then you can eventually convert it into a full C corp. And there's tax ramifications to that, but it's a little more nimble. No one's ever going to tell you have to go reincorporate if you start out as a corporation. Anyway, maybe more information than you know. The big thing to take away is don't go running a business without some kind of entity around yourself. It's a great shield, and it's low cost. You should absolutely do it. Yeah.
So,
I don't mind at all.
When I went out to be a one-man shop, I was told that I should still form an LLC, but ultimately it was like a speed bump, a legal speed bump, and nobody really wanted to come after me. And I think you kind of touched on that idea of piercing. Now, is there anything that you can do? Are there any steps you can take to strengthen that, or is it just the way that it is?
No. I think you can absolutely make that LLC be a very good shield. So the steps you need to have protection from the corporation are you have to form the corporation. So that's like the threshold thing. If you don't have that, they're going to come right at you. If you do have it, a lot of lawyers will look at that and be like, okay, well, does this corporation have any money? They may not even try to pierce the corporate veil because it's usually a tough fight. But actually, in order to get the protection that the entity provides, you got to have the entity. You have to go through what they call like corporate formalities, which means you need to elect your directors, your officers. You need to have minutes and keep a minute book, and that stuff isn't really hard to do. You can do it yourself. And Jonathan Ryan is in the audience, and he's also a lawyer, and he has also given a talk like this, and he's an awesome resource.
I was just going to say one of the big differences between an LLC and S corp, tax-wise, you can have an LLC and choose to be taxed as an S corp. So the big people want to be taxed as an S corp because it's a flow through entity. So you can give yourself a salary and then take the rest of it preferred distributions and save yourself money on taxes. It also comes down to what you're talking about. An LLC, and you did mention this. If you go to court, there's not a lot of case law. So it talks about, especially if you're in like either not a Delaware or not, if you're not adopting a Delaware or New York law for an LLC. But an LLC, you don't have to follow the corporate formalities as well. Or stringent. Whereas if you're an S corporation, he's right. You need to have corporate minutes. You need to have an annual meeting. You need to, anything you need to do. But the big major ones are A, have you actually incorporated? B, do you have a membership agreement? Even if you're a solo LLC, you need a membership agreement, even for yourself, and you actually treat the business like a business. So do you have a separate bank account? Do you commingle funds?
Yeah.
These are all the things he's talking about when he says corporate form.
Yeah. And also capitalization to some extent. Like if somebody comes to sue you and you say sorry, I've got an LLC, you've got no recourse at all, and they look at you and they say, well, you don't have any equipment, you don't have any property, you've got no money in your bank account. Like the court doesn't like to see people get screwed. So if they see an entity that doesn't really look like a real entity, they might take that as an opportunity to try to pierce. But you can get around that either by having reasonable amount of assets, keep some money in the bank account for the business, or a real good kind of silver bullet for this stuff is to carry some insurance. And most people really don't do that. I mean, I don't have a separate insurance policy for my corporation, so I don't necessarily follow this advice myself. But I also have some cash in the bank for that business, so I don't worry that much about people suing me and saying this business is a complete sham. But insurance is a great answer to that, because the insurance provides some remedy for people when they sue you, and you can say, yes, our business is cash poor and we don't have a lot of stuff, but we did the reasonable thing and we got insurance so that if somebody sued us, that they wouldn't be stuck with nothing, and that'll go a long way too.
It's fairly cheap.
Yep. Insurance is cheap.
Insurance on an LLC, unless you're doing a ton of money, it's very cheap. Like
Yeah.
$200, maybe a year.
Yeah, it's
$500 a year or something like that.
Yeah, it's worth doing just to give you that shield. It's kind of an inexpensive shield against these types of claims. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Mhm.
Might be more accounting than.
Sure. If I don't know, I'll
No,
tell you.
that's why I'm giving the preface. So I work full time for a company, but on the side they allow me to teach, which I get paid for, and I consult in iOS related consulting, and I bring decent money in. And I talked to my accountant about it a year or two ago, and I asked this exact question. He's like, you won't get any benefit from it. And I didn't really believe him. And I haven't really found anything online. So for me, at the end of the day, I'm looking to keep as much money as I can. So I'm getting paid through weird sources, Venmo, or cash, or PayPal.
Right. Well, it complicates things. When you have a corporation or an LLC, you have to keep those separate bank accounts, which means you're filing 2 tax returns. Usually it's flow through, but you still need to file a tax return for your organization. So there is some kind of administrative and financial overhead that goes with it. And I guess I'd say the main thing you're getting out of it is if somebody sues you, you're going to have them sue the corporation instead of you, and then you need to kind of make that assessment for yourself about how likely you think that is. If the work you're doing is really low risk, maybe you run the risk. If it'll save you probably $1,000 or something like that. But if you think there's even like a 5% chance that somebody's going to sue you, it might be worth it.
Okay. Well,
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But that gets the 50% of my answer. The other answer, this is where the accounting question comes in.
Yeah.
From your own experience, if I were, I don't know what you do with your own little corp. I don't know if that's your full-time job. I'm unsure if it's something else you do on top of that. But if I were to, when I were to be paying tax at the end of the year, let's say I buy like $20K, my salary.
Right.
Bigger than that. Do I get charged? Would I get taxed differently if I was an LLC making $20K versus as Arthur making whatever I make plus the $20K on top?
Well, your salary is going to be handled like through a normal salary process. They're going to take withholding, all that'll happen. So assuming you're breaking even and you've paid all the taxes you need to pay on that salaried job, the extra money is going to get charged to you. Probably it's a flow through entity. That's what the S corp and the LLC is.
It's ordinary income. So essentially, in your case, let's say the 20K benefit won't be taxed, but I guess you could say that the LLC gives you a $10,000 salary, and then $10,000 is considered non-FICA income,
Right.
non-W2 income. The benefit that you're going to get is right now, like let's say you buy an iPhone, right? If you buy an iPhone and you don't have a corporation and you deduct that iPhone, which you can do even as an individual, it raises a much bigger red flag than if you have an LLC that's for iPhone consulting and you buy an iPhone for an LLC.
So
Yeah, that's a great example, and it even can to some extent offset all those additional, like a couple $100 here and there, and the additional tax filing. I mean, if you're like me, a lot of the things you buy relate to coding and stuff, and you'll get some real value from that.
I feel like I can push this farther, but
Yeah.
Talk to you
No,
after.
it's I mean that's a great point about the deductions because it doesn't raise red flags. I have this corporation and I do all my work through the corporation. Everything I do is even the legal work and the iPhone work are all kind of rolled up into one company. But I have so few expenses because I work from home. I buy a computer every couple of years. I pay for my malpractice insurance. When I buy anything that's related at all to the business, I write it off, and I don't worry a whole lot about it being a red flag because my business the IRS is going to look at my at my income and my expenses and just say this guy's like, I mean, he's not spending a lot of money on expenses. So it's kind of it's really great for that, and especially because the stuff that I work on also happens to be stuff I'm really interested in. So when I buy like a video game that I want to play, I write that off because sometimes I make video games and sell them, and it's perfectly legitimate research and development.
Can't you technically allow that right on your personal tax?
You could, but the IRS is more critical of that kind of thing.
It looks like, I mean, the problem is the way it looks to IRS. If you have an incorporated entity, it's much more easier to justify than I bought something that I use in my personal time all the time, but it's a business expense as well. So it's more as bad as it sounds is how the IRS will see it.
Yeah.
The big thing here is we're both attorneys. A CPA is the best person.
Yeah, CPAs. They'll,
That kind of stuff. But this should be general stuff that we should tell you. And it probably depends on how much money you're making, whether it makes sense, and whether it saves you.
Yeah, yeah.
Versus the administrative headache of filing.
But as a lawyer, one of our primary jobs is to kind of try to keep you guys out of trouble. And having an entity, even though it costs some money, like it makes us as the lawyers feel a lot more comfortable because we won't get the phone call that says I'm being sued and I got named individually in this lawsuit. It keeps us from getting that phone call and keeps you from having to call us about it in that way. So yeah, it's a good move for a lot of reasons. Anybody else have questions about corporate formation stuff?
One thing is just kind of related to I've done all variations of this over the years. But one thing you could do, which isn't as good as the S Corp LLC, is you could just, well, I think what you're referring to is just having a Schedule C on that income, and then saying, I don't have an entity, but I run a hobby business,
Yeah,
do something
yeah.
on the side, I have 20K income, and I have these expenses. It just back to it doesn't look as good. Like the rule of thumb I always use is just like, how does this look? Like, is it reasonable and what makes sense? And if you have an entity and it's separate and you're going through all these steps, these corporate activities, it's just don't push it.
I have a feeling that's what my accountant was doing because when I gave him any detail, but essentially whenever I give him all my paperwork, he's like any of the side stuff he did doesn't, anything you don't have a legitimately like a W-2 40, 1099 or something else. Give it to me separately. I will take care of that without getting into the nitty-gritty. So I have a feeling that's what he's doing.
Yeah. I mean, it can definitely be handled, but like you said, the optics of it. One of the things that I do, and again, this is kind of treading into accounting, which is outside of my area, which is why some of my accounting practices are not like. So the example I'm about to give is like I work from home, right? I should technically be able to take this home office deduction because I have an office that I use all day for work. I don't do it because it's a pretty small part of the house, and the deduction is pretty small, and I know that home office deduction is just like one of those things that in the algorithm that they're using to determine if they want to audit you, taking that home office deduction is going to bump up that audit. So your home office better be a pretty good deduction if you're willing to do that. So like another example of like I could probably optimize a little better and get a better tax deduction if I deducted my office, but I don't do it for that same reason that I wouldn't deduct a bunch of personal stuff without the corporation. Yeah.
I'll
Yep.
make one comment on home office deduction. So I did that this past year, and one of the benefits of going through all the effort to do that right, because it takes a little effort, is if we got a new air conditioner,
Mm-hmm.
and that costs $3,000. The percentage of your house that's covered by your home office, a portion of that new air conditioner is naturally
Deductible.
so
Yeah.
if you end up having things done in your house that do in some way modify your small space, it can make it worthwhile. Now if you don't have any of those things done, it's just going to home office and home is stat, then yeah.
That's totally right. Yeah, it's a trade-off.
It make it worthwhile for me, at least in this past year.
It's
to go through this and have
Yeah, it's just an administrative problem and this optical thing, because I mean you can write all that stuff off, but you have to like for the home office thing you got to like, you know, measure your office and give a good percentage of the size of the house, and it always just feels like, I don't know, it feels like a lot of math for me to have to work out and justify to people and in my particular case it just doesn't add up to very much, so I don't do it. But yeah, I mean, if you ever have to replace your roof, I mean that's a pretty expensive thing, and it affects the house. I do write off things like the cable, because the cable runs into both my office and the house and things like that. I kind of so I there are certain expenses that apply to both that I can apportion some of it to the business, but I only do the ones that are relatively easy to document. Yeah.
So I was just going to add on that I think another aspect of that is that if you do reserve part of your home for a home office, you're not supposed to use it for other stuff.
Right. I mean, I think there's some percentage you probably could, but yeah.
It doesn't have to be exclusive.
Okay.
Generally, the ask you is 70% goes in, 30% whatever. And then they take whatever the percentage is, and then they want to know what's your mortgage. Well, so you say the office space is 30% of your house, and they do 30% of your mortgage, and then you say you use it 70% of the time, and they do 70% of that, you get what you're deduction.
Yeah.
One last thing I'll add,
Sure.
also similar to you don't deduct the home office thing, because for me it doesn't come out to work. If you do a lot of on-site with clients, in order to deduct travel, you have to have a home office.
Oh, really?
Travel from, yeah.
Huh, that's interesting.
Like mileage, travel expenses, if you don't declare a home office.
That might make it worth it if you drive a lot, because those deductions for travel is actually pretty good. I think it's like 35 cents a mile or something like that. Adds up a lot. Cool. Yep.
But it's kind of related, but like co-working fees, is that going to be a
Like if you pay a co-working space,
Right.
I think that's a pretty easy. Again, that's more accounting than I know, but it strikes me as being a pretty straight up expense for your business.
They have this thing in law school, and I'm sure that you were taught this, is called the smell test. And anything ethical, they say generally the smell test will tell you whether you're doing something ethical or not. I think it applies to same expenses. If you're having to really scrape to justify it, you might not be there.
Yeah, but things like co-working spaces are that's like that passes the smell test super easy. Yeah, totally. That's a good way to put it. If you're really scraping, this might not be a good idea. Yeah.
The only other thing I would say, and this applies to me and my situation, is if you are dealing with anybody that's a foreign alien, so anybody non-domestic U.S. person as a business partner, you can incorporate as an LLC or an S corp.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So,
That's right.
so
Yeah.
you have to do a C corp. So this gets a little sticky when you want to have forms.
So you're saying that if I were to have a one-man shop and I decide to have a two-man shop, and I'm an LLC at that point, that person is accountable for.
You could do some kind of partnership, like a contract with them, but they couldn't have a membership stake in that LLC. You'd have to convert. And the same thing if you on the off chance you wanted to have, I think it's 35. If you want to have like more than 35 members or owners of your company, once it gets to be a certain size, they have to be an S corp or a C corp. And then there's also some limitations on, like, I think companies can't be. Is that right? Companies can't be an owner. Like so you can't have like a big corporation as an individual member of your LLC. I think they have to actually be individuals.
Even if they're like resident aliens, is that still an issue, or?
I don't know. I'm not sure what the limitation is. If you're pushing up against those things, it seems like a no-brainer to just go with the C corp or the S corp instead. I mean, they're not that different. If you think you're going to grow and you think you're going to give away shares, or you want to do an employee option plan or something like that, anytime you're moving beyond kind of like a really basic, simple business, I think the S corp is going to be the better vehicle. You just won't run into those barriers, and when you want to grow, you won't have to reorganize somehow. Yeah. Cool. So the next thing I'll talk about is when you got your company started up, and you're starting to build a product, right? And so the types of things that you're going to think about when you're building an iPhone application are, where's the code that you're writing coming from? In a simple case, you're writing it all yourself. But that's not usually how it works. So if you're hiring any contractors or employees, the important thing to take away from this talk is to make sure you have some kind of employment agreement or contractor agreement in place with them. And it's even more important for contractors, because the default rule for contractors is if you hire a contractor to build something for you and you don't have an agreement, you just shake hands, or they just send you an invoice and you pay it, technically they own the work product that they provided to you. You end up with a license to the thing they made, and that's messy. For one thing, they can use the work product they created for you for other customers, which is terrible, right? Like, you don't want them to take the code to the next guy, your competitor, and then charge them half what they charged you to give them the same thing that you paid them to make. So that's bad. And then, I don't know, the other thing would be, if you have this implied license that isn't even documented, it becomes kind of amorphous as to what your license even is, and a court's going to have to look at that license and just kind of try to interpret whatever the intent was. Like, so what did this contractor intend for you to be able to do? Did he intend for you to be able to change the code? Did he intend for you to be able to sell the code to someone else? And so then you're in a position where you've got this cloud over your IP where nobody really knows what your license is until you go adjudicate it, and that's not great. Especially if you build this thing that's awesome, somebody comes to buy it, and they say, okay, show me the documents from the people that built this thing, and you say, well, here's the invoice, and they're going to say, you need to go back to that contractor and get them to sign something, and that's not the time you want to go back to the contractor to get him to sign something, because at that point, they've got you over a barrel, and they can hold out for, they can be the thing that jams up your deal. Or worst case, they might just disappear. You might not be able to find them. And then the other thing is, the other place that your code is going to come from if you don't write it yourself is if you license it in from other people. So either licensing proprietary libraries or code, or grabbing open source code from the internet. And the important thing to know there is to just read the license agreement so you know what your rights are. Proprietary code, when you're looking at a license, it's more about, does this license cover the things that I need to do? And what kind of warranties am I getting? What kind of indemnity am I getting from the person that's licensing this to me? Indemnities typically deal with IP infringement, and you're talking about if you get sued because you put this library into your code, is the developer of that code going to protect you? And typically, open source code never comes with any of that stuff. And really low cost third-party code, like proprietary code, also probably doesn't come with that stuff if you're paying $100 or $10. But if you need that protection, maybe because you're shipping a product that's going to have a really mass audience, or you just have a lot at risk, you want to make sure you get a license from some proprietary code maker that has warranties of non-infringement and IP indemnity, so that you know that if you get sued because that code wasn't really theirs to give you, that you're not stuck having to pay off somebody that actually does own that code. And then the other thing to know about open source code is that it's fantastic, it's free, it can really accelerate your project, but it is, for the most part, as is. There's no warranties that come with it, and so it's only kind of as good as the word of the person who gives it to you. Somebody could pop up and say, that open source library that you used is not really open source. These guys stole our code. In which case you're on the hook for the infringement. It also doesn't come with any warranties of kind of quality, right? So you're getting it all as is. So anyway, those two ways of getting code into your project are both fantastic. I use both options, but you just want to know when you're doing that what the risk is that you're posing to your business, because you just especially with open source, you really don't know where it came from. Yep.
I was just going to say, maybe this is slightly separated, I'm covering it later, but from both an employer and employee perspective, what about when they're doing work on something? Like, you have a full-time job, and you set up an LLC, you go through this. How does that impact? Are there things that, as an employer, you should be putting into your employment agreements, and then from the employee side, what should you be looking for?
Absolutely,
yeah.
yeah.
I see things over time, I'm like, goodness, I don't want to sign this. And
Yeah.
Do they overreach, or what should we be looking for?
Often, if you're the employee, there's a good chance that it overreaches. The lawyers that work for companies, including myself, will give them a contract that is going to cover as much as possible. And those things are also very negotiable, unless it's a client that somehow is off on their own, just telling people they won't make changes. Anytime a client sends me changes to an employment agreement, there's tons of things in there that could potentially be changed without any kind of friction, if you're willing to ask. And so, in particular, the scope of the IP assignment is something to pay attention to, on both sides. So the broad scoped IP assignment looks something like this. It would say, the employee agrees to assign all intellectual property rights that he creates during the term of his employment with the employer. And that's ugly, right? Because that's everything. They're saying you're working for us. If you create it on the side, if you create it within the business, we own it. Now that may not be enforceable in some states. In California and Washington, you can't take ownership of things that people create outside of their work for you as long as they don't use your equipment and it doesn't relate to your business. So there's some exceptions there, but that is the kind of the default go-to in a lot of employment contracts. What I usually change that to when I'm working with employees that are taking a new job is to try to change it to things that are created within the scope of my employment. And that creates a nice line that says, if you ask me to build it for you, I'll build it, and you'll own it. If you didn't ask me to do it and it's not within the scope of what you hired me to do, then you don't have any claim over it. Most employment agreements will also have stuff in there. Pre-existing work is typically something that you'll continue to own. But if you take that pre-existing work that you have, like libraries or code that you've used in the past, and you bring it into your work product and deliver it to the company, they'll end up usually under the agreement with a very broad license to do whatever they want with it. And that strikes me as being pretty fair, because you don't want an employee to like bring his own code into the project and then somehow come to you later and say you didn't have the right to use it. That doesn't seem equitable.
And does that where an entity helps in that though? Also, that I'm doing stuff on the side as an employee for another entity, or it doesn't.
They can still, the contract between you and the company is between you as the individual and the company as the employee, and so you still have to comply. If you assign that stuff to another company, they could probably still come at you.
The only difference, like one of the major things that he's touching on is around in software. It's really easy. The legal framework around it is work for hire. I mean, that's like work for hire. I think there's 8 categories, and they try to apply software to these 8 categories, but explicitly software is not a category.
Yeah.
So if you're an employee and it's work for hire work and they can prove it's work for hire, then it's real simple, right? If you're a contractor, then like you said, not only do you need an agreement if you have a contractor, you need an agreement signed before they start work, before they pay anything. It needs to be in place. It's commission work. So that's a big thing. I mean, the big thing for me on the open source stuff is I don't know how many people I know that customers are that have GPL licenses.
Yeah.
In their licenses, you can literally send them an email and say, yes, I'd like a copy of your source code. Please send it over now.
Yeah, that's something I totally forgot to mention. But open source, not all open source is created equal. It used to be that open source was just a really dirty word because almost all the open source was GPL code, which is like this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the GPL. The GPL is kind of like a viral open source license, and it wasn't written by lawyers. It was written by a guy named Richard Stallman, who's kind of a fanatical software guy, and he's got great ideas, but his contract that he wrote for this particular license is not clear legally. It's kind of ambiguous, and it also, what it's attempting to do is say, if you can use my code, but if you build something with it, you gotta make your code free. And so it's like a virus that hits your code, infects it, and technically you lose the right to deny people the source code if they ask for it. So it's super ugly.
The other thing I say is generally what happens when employers give you, especially like you mentioned, there's statutes, and I know California, I don't know Washington, but that specifically talk about previous ownership. Or the problem is so what a California employer will do is actually put it out there and give you an exhibit to your employment agreement and say, if you don't list it here, then we own it, right? And so what you have to do is be really explicit, or try to get rid of that exhibit.
Get rid of the exhibit, or fill the exhibit with really general stuff that says like, oh, I'm excluding, my pre-existing inventions are all work related to this thing, as opposed to trying to spell out individual libraries. So try to get away from that exhibit. The exhibit in a lot of contracts that have that exhibit is intended to be like a non-exclusive list of all the things that you own. But in practice, if you don't list it and then you get in a fight over it later, it's going to look pretty bad when you're saying, I own this thing. And then they're saying, well, you didn't list it. So
Update it, like during your employment, like you're going to remember that, hey, I might go fight with these guys, but it's going well right now.
yeah, it always seems good at the time until it's not. Yeah. That's a good point.
One thing that I do to kind of try to avoid that IP issues with my day job versus my LLC is not use personal devices to develop my day job, and vice versa, for sure. But
That's a good move. Yeah.
it can get expensive, and it can be difficult. But I don't hook up my work or my personal phone to my work email, and I want to keep a firewall between
That's
It's a
a.
little cumbersome because sometimes you have to create new
It's kind of a pain, but it's a vulner. If you use any hardware from your work, you're creating like a like from a security standpoint, it's a vulnerability in your ability to claim ownership of that thing, and so you're just exposing one more attack. And
We'll see something now, right?
yeah,
The perfect example of this, right?
yeah. I'm trying to think. Think about it like this. You probably a lot of people think, okay, well, I'm going to build this thing on the side, and my employer doesn't care. It doesn't relate to their business. On the off chance that the thing you built becomes the next big thing, somebody at that company is going to say, didn't that guy work for us while he did it? And I guarantee somebody's going to start looking at that contract to see if they have a stake, because they'll come at you and say, you built this on our dime, and then whether they're right or not, it'll probably happen at the time when you're about to go public or about to get a big huge investment, and they'll hear about it, and it'll be something you have to clean up. Even if they're wrong, you probably still have to clean it up. So you want to keep it real clean. Okay, so the next thing we talk about is, so you built your app and now you're about to ship it. And the question is, do you need your own custom end user license agreement when you ship things on the App Store? And that's a tricky question. If you don't have, where's our feed? Apple's end user license agreement that they attach to all purchases is not terrible. It's baked into the process. When a user signs up for iTunes, it says you're going to download apps sometimes, and if those apps don't have an end-user license agreement attached to them, then these are the terms that apply. And they're not terrible, but there are some weaknesses. And so if your app is a hobby app and it's not super risky, it's not likely to cause a lot of harm, and it's not likely to make you a ton of money, you might just go with their form. It's not a bad way to go. I've shipped lots of apps that don't have custom end-user license agreements, and I can draft an end-user license agreement without it costing me anything. So it's not like it's a necessity for every app. But I'll tell you, the weaknesses are that agreement is between Apple and the customer, and you are at best maybe a third-party beneficiary. So if you ever do need to enforce that agreement against the customer, you're going to be in a weaker position to do so, because you don't have a direct connection with that customer. You have to kind of argue that you are a beneficiary of this contract and you're going to enforce the terms. So that may not be great. The other thing is that if you have like a particularly risky app that somebody like a turn-by-turn directions or something where somebody could actually get hurt, a medical app, and you have particular things about your app that are keeping you up at night because you're worried that a user's going to do something stupid, you might want to bake some disclaimers into your end-user license agreement that hit on those things, so that when the guy gets hurt, you can say, our agreement says you're not supposed to use it for this thing. And I guarantee, like, so turn-by-turn directions app might say, don't use this while you're driving. And there's no disclaimer in Apple's terms of service that say, if you're using an app that is for driving, don't use it while driving. So you may want to include some of your own custom disclaimers in there. And then you may want to go further than that. In that example, you may even want to pop up something on the screen. You've probably seen it in navigation type apps where they kind of ask you to click through or no. It's such an important notice. They want to make sure that they're being really obvious so no one can claim that they didn't know. And then the other thing is that if you have an app that takes user-generated content, which is like any kind of photo sharing app or an app where people are posting content, and you think there's a possibility that the content that they post could be infringing, Apple's end user license agreement doesn't have DMCA language in it, and it's certainly not specific to you. So you need an end user license agreement in that case that explains to people how they can get in touch with you if they think that their content is being infringed inside of your app. And if you do that, you'll get protection. If you don't do it, they can sue you directly for the infringement that your users do. So that would be, anytime you have end user generated content in your app is a great reason to do your own EULA. Yep.
Can I ask a DMCA question?
Oh, sure.
So let's say things happen and it's popping up, whatever. I put it up on the store. Somebody clones my app in some way, whether they might describe reverse engineering.
Sure.
What are my recourses for contacting Apple first to say, hey, something, or B, going the MCA route and saying, hey, somebody copied my intellectual property?
Right. So the DMCA probably isn't going to apply a whole lot to that problem. It's a great question, and we should dive into it, especially before we run out of time, because I've got some great stories about dealing with Apple on infringing stuff. So we should definitely get into that, and maybe now's the time. DMCA, there's different sections of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. The section you're thinking of is probably the anti-circumvention section, which is something that gives you the right to sue people if they violate your copy protection, or if you have user authentication or some kind of anti-piracy or content like a DRM baked into your app, and somebody circumvents the DRM. you might be able to use the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to go after them for that. It's kind of it's an ugly part of the DMCA that a lot of us don't like because it kind of expands copyright law, but it's not something that I've seen a lot of individual developers or companies actually use for their benefit. Typically, if somebody's stolen your code, you're going to go after them for like a copyright infringement. It's really rare to see somebody say, "Oh, and you also violated the DMCA, and I'm going to go after you for that." I just haven't seen it that much. The DMCA component that this applies to is a separate section of the DMCA that's all about safe harbor for ISPs, and it was created for like in the early days of the internet. There were AOL and all these companies like I don't know, maybe MySpace, companies where they're operating a platform and they're saying, okay, we're a telecommunications company. We're sending emails back and forth over our pipe, and we do not want to be responsible for the emails that people send. And so they went to Congress and got this baked into the DMCA to say, if you are running a certain type of platform and you're kind of hands off and the content is flowing over your platform, then and assuming you go through the right steps, you're not responsible for the copyright infringement of your users. And that's kind of spread to apply to things like Facebook and any kind of place where users are posting content. As long as you follow the right rules, you can avoid liability for that. So it's totally kind of separate part of the DMCA. But let's talk a little bit about IP. I think we're running short on time, so I'm gonna skim through this stuff really quickly. Some of this talk is talking about the various types of IP and which types of intellectual property you might want to pursue in order to protect your interests in your own apps. And the short answer is I kind of talk a little bit about intellectual property being magic. It's not this dorky kind of magic with card tricks. It's like a super powerful magic like you would think of in like a Dungeons & Dragons or something like that. It's super powerful, and what I think is the coolest thing about intellectual property is that unlike these other types of property, you've got personal property, which is like things that you own. You got real property, which is like houses and land. Or not, houses probably aren't technically the real property, but the thing about intellectual property that's different from all those things is that all those other things you have to acquire physically. You have to go find somebody who has the thing you want. You have to buy it from them. You have to find the land or the house that you want, and you have to buy it from somebody with money. Intellectual property is a kind of property that you can own that has value that you get to create out of your own brain with nothing. It literally can materialize out of nothing. It's just the product of your effort and your creativity, and that's one of the things I think is just like amazingly magical about intellectual property, because somebody with no resources at all can still write a novel that is amazing and make money with it, or write an amazing piece of code with no resources other than their mind and I guess the computer or the pen that they need to write it. So I think that stuff's really cool. So I like to talk about that. It's like Green Lantern has this like he can conjure things up with his mind. Like it's the same deal. You can conjure up really powerful things with your mind, and then when people decide to take them from you, the intellectual property rights give you the power of the government to enforce that stuff. So you've got like the U.S. military behind all the things that you own. If somebody tries to steal it from you, you can go to court. The government will protect you, and you can get a sheriff to come and repossess their assets. I mean, it's one of your rights as a citizen to have protection for this kind of thing, and it's kind of cool to be able to take advantage of it as a software developer. But that's a kind of a digression. There are patents, copyrights, and trademarks are kind of the core types of IP. There's also trade secret, but I won't talk too much about that. The main thing to take away here is for a typical indie developer, the things that I like to focus them on are trademark as the primary way to protect their app. It's very difficult. Patents are expensive and they take several years to get. And it's for a smaller company or indie developer, it tends to not be a very good choice. But trademarks are inexpensive and they run forever. And so we're short on time, so I won't get into too much detail. But I would just say, if you're thinking about any kind of way to protect your app, try to come up with a brand for that app that's distinctive, that is unique to you, that you can protect. Don't call your calculator app world's greatest calculator app. Call your calculator app something that is distinctive, so that people will associate it with you and not the thing that the app does. That'll give you some ability to protect it. You can also create a unique look and feel in your app that is somewhat protectable, and that'll actually give you something that you can use to assert your rights against the copycats that will undoubtedly come up and copy your app if it has any degree of success. And then copyright, which I used to say, don't worry that much about copyright. Copyright is protection that covers your expressive, creative expressions. So it actually covers like your code itself, covers the graphics that are in your app, things that you create. And it's a really powerful right, but you don't necessarily have to register it to have protection. There's some copyright protection that comes into existence just automatically. And I used to say don't worry that much about it. But then I had an app that was like completely ripped off. And by ripped off, I don't mean they like copied the interface. I mean they took all the art assets, they took all the images, they took all the sounds. The whole purpose of the app is I do mostly meditation and relaxation apps. They pulled all the audio from the meditations in my app and rolled out their own app with it. And it was like the most blatant violation of copyright that you could imagine. And so I contacted Apple. And I said, Apple, these guys stole my whole app. Go take a look. My app's been on the store for years and years, and these guys came on, a month ago, and it's exactly the same stuff. Can you do something about it? And they said, this is Apple's process for that, is to say, okay, well, let's put you on an email thread with the guy who stole all your stuff, and we'll just see if you guys can work it out. Turns out the guy that stole all my stuff's in Russia, and he has no interest in working it all out. And it took, I think it took 3 or 4 months to get the thing taken down. And eventually I had to write a letter to the general counsel at Apple and just plead my case. And it wasn't like a legal letter like, hey, Apple, you need to do something about this right away. It was like, dear Apple, I'm a individual developer who's like been on your platform a long time. I just plead with you to take a look at this case because it's really blatant. Because you can't tell Apple what to do. You just have to hope that they'll help you. And when they got that letter, it came down really quick. But so I guess because we're short on time, the quick answer is if someone infringes your stuff, go through the process with Apple. But if it's not working and you're just not getting anywhere, you should try to write a letter. They'll respond to a letter differently than they will that click-through form that says someone infringed. And so that's the short answer. But it's tough. I mean, And that was a really unique case because they really did take stuff that they couldn't take. Most people that copy apps just rip off the app, but they still make it from scratch. Most people that steal your app aren't going to steal all the images. So yeah, it's a tough one.
What's the difference between a C corp and S corp?
C corp and S corp. So a C corp is kind of what you think of when you think of these giant companies. Like any kind of corporation on the stock exchange is a C corp. That's the traditional corporation. An S corp is a special kind of corporation that exists for small businesses. I think the main benefit of it is that the tax treatment is different because you're small. They don't want you to be taxed at 2 levels. A C corporation, these big companies, they make money and then they have to pay money to the government on the corporation level, and then they pay all their investors the distributions from the company, and then those investors pay taxes on it. And I think they must have thought that small businesses, that was a little too heavy-handed. And so the biggest benefit to having a S corporation versus C corporation is you get to flow through those profits and losses to your personal income tax, and you don't get taxed at 2 levels. I'm trying to think what other. If you happen to have a business that doesn't make any money, if you pay yourself all the money it makes, then it might not be that expensive to be a C corporation because the C corporation may never post any profit because all the profits are leaving the business. But if you want to keep any money in the company, it could cost you a bit more to have a C corporation than an S corporation. But if you ever want to go public or raise money from institutional investors or get more than 35 investors in your company, you'll have to switch to a C corp. The nice thing is that S corps are just C corps with a little election. It's like you check a box and say I'm an S corp, and whenever the time comes that you no longer qualify for an S corp, maybe because you have 36 investors instead of 35, or because you bring in an international partner that becomes a member in your company and breaks your ability to qualify, your corporation automatically converts to a C corporation without you having to even file anything. You just the next year you just file your taxes as a C corporation. So the S corporation is super flexible in that way. Or I mean, S corporation can easily be converted to the C corporation and then take you multinational. Any other questions? I think I'm gonna, just because I know we're running out of time and so many other things to talk about, but this is me. Feel free. I'm here, for the whole conference. Feel free to ask me or Jonathan. Jonathan's a great resource too. We're both kind of like recovering lawyers. We would prefer not to be practicing law. We'd prefer to be making apps and doing cool things. But we're happy to talk with you about your stuff. And you may find that you get, I don't know about better advice from us than you get from a regular lawyer, but you might get a little bit more informal advice because we're sort of hybrid. So remember our faces. We're good resources. I hope you don't mind me offering up your services. Yeah.
Do you have any more time?
Yeah, I've got plenty of time as long as there isn't like another talk coming in.
Will your slides be up somewhere?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I can put them up on. Maybe I'll post them to the Slack. I don't know what's the best. I don't know if they have an official conference channel. I'll post it to Slack. Yeah.
So, I do have a question for you.
Sure.
So this might be a common scenario for a lot of
indie or small kind of one-man shops or whatever. Let's say you've done this, you've got an LLC, you've got an idea, but you need to bring in somebody else. You don't want to hire them as an employee because that gets complicated, and you want to make it fair for both parties. So how would you share the IP or share the product that you might develop? Do you have to start a new LLC to do that, or is there like some sort of joint venture thing that you would do?
Yeah, a lot of times people call me and say, we want to do a joint venture, and joint ventures are kind of a big deal. It's not something you want to do lightly. It's kind of like a marriage. So I would hesitate to steer you toward a joint venture. Because the thing about joint ventures is you're creating this joint thing that's really hard to take apart. It's like a marriage where the divorce is going to be really ugly. So I have an example like that. So I've got my company is a corporation. I have a business partner who is he does all the content for these meditation apps. The two of us partnered up a long time ago. He writes all the material and records it, gives me the MP3 files, and I turn it into the apps and run the business. And so he gets a piece of that. We share all the profits of the business. But it's still a contract. He has his company and I have my company. He licenses his content into my company, and I pay him a rev share, just like a publisher would. But we are really tight. I mean, we talk weekly, and all the decisions we make about the business, regardless of technically the contract gives me a lot of control. But I mean, we really run that business like a partnership. But it's technically it's two different businesses, which is really great for the deduction thing, because there are things that I deduct that he may not think are great expenses for the business, and that allows me to deduct the things that I think are important, and allows him to deduct the things he thinks are important. So I would strongly recommend, if you're partnering up with somebody, to try to just do it contractually. Just put a rev share in place. You really do want the IP to be owned in one place. There is such a thing as joint ownership of IP. It's kind of an ugly thing. There are various ways you could do it. You could say we both own this code, and we both independently can go commercialize it without any right of approval from the other one, which means now you lost your monopoly that you have in that thing. You have a competitor right out of the gate, which is going to hurt yourself in the market. If you do the opposite, where neither one of you can do anything unless you both agree, you have this situation where you stop getting along, and all of a sudden the IP's locked up, and nobody can do anything with it. So it's kind of better for it to be in one person's hands, ideally your hands, if you can make it work. Yeah. Yeah.
So
He would agree. He wanted it in his hands.
Everybody wants it in their hands. Yeah. Maybe there's a buyout provision. Maybe you do something. There's lots of ways to solve that problem, where you could say, some kind of a rev share that exists perpetually, but the ability to buy the other person out of the business if you need to, or vice versa.
Key, right? Because one of the things that there's all the fun stuff that might happen if you guys stop becoming friends, right?
Right.
But there's the potentially real world issue where let's say I get hit by a big red bus.
Yeah.
Who owns the IP then? Right?
Yeah. Well, it's
You write it in the contract in such a way that LLC, you write all those things.
What do you say? I mean, he's giving you not individual advice, but he's saying if he was in your shoes and there was the best way to do it contractually, it's better for you to have more control.
Yeah, that's my own personal preference, and that's the way I did it. But you're right. I mean, if you want to just do a traditional, in your situation, you already have an LLC. I'm assuming you have income from other places that you don't want to share with this other person. So you could very well create a new LLC for the two of you. It's not that expensive. Keep all the IP in that LLC. Oh, I gotta go. I'm getting the hook. Thank you, everybody. If you see me around, feel free to ask questions.